Late at night, two sisters knocked on an old woman's door. She looked at their stomachs and cried.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The urgent knocking shattered the stillness of the house. Mrs. Josephine raised her head from the old wooden chair near the fireplace, her trembling hands placing a book down on the table. Who could possibly be visiting at this hour, in such frigid weather? Grasping an oil lamp, she approached the door, its warm glow illuminating her eyes clouded by years but still sharp and perceptive. The knocking sounded again, more insistent, as if whoever was outside was fighting against the cruel winter night. Hold on. I'm coming. Mrs. Josephine called out, her voice tinged with worry. When the door opened, she froze at the sight before her. Two young girls, about 16 years old, stood shivering in the snow. Both were dressed in thin clothing, their faces pale from the cold and exhaustion. But what stunned her most were their swollen bellies. Both were pregnant, clearly close to their due dates. Please, help us, one of the girls whispered hoarsely, her voice raspy from hunger and cold. This girl, with long brown hair, nearly collapsed before the other managed to catch her. My goodness! Come inside. Don't stay out here any longer. Mrs. Josephine hastily ushered the girls in and slammed the door shut to keep the cold at bay. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace enveloped the two girls. They sank into chairs, clutching the thin blankets Mrs. Josephine quickly handed them. She poured 2 cups of hot tea, placing them on the table with a look of deep concern. Who are you? Why are you out in this weather? She asked, her tone a mix of sternness and care. The girl with brown hair, the one who had whispered outside, sipped her tea and tried to answer. I'm Mary, and this is my sister, Anna. We have nowhere else to go. Mrs. Josephine's gaze shifted to Anna, the younger girl with black hair and dark, shadowed eyes. Anna said nothing, only nodding weakly, clearly exhausted. On closer inspection, Mrs. Josephine noticed the girl's chapped lips, frostbitten hands, and faint bruises on her wrists. She didn't press further, but her heart ached. Have you eaten anything? She asked gently. Mary shook her head, her voice trembling. No, ma'am. Oh, heavens! Mrs. Josephine stood up abruptly, pulling a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a bowl of warm soup from the cupboard. She placed them before the girls, her eyes brimming with compassion. Eat. Eat. Don't say anything yet. You need your strength first. Mary and Anna didn't need any more urging. They devoured the food as though they hadn't seen a meal in days. Watching them, Mrs. Josephine couldn't help but wonder what had driven these young girls to such desperate circumstances. Who were they? Why had they appeared in this remote village on a freezing winter night? When the girls had finished eating and begun to calm down, Mary cautiously began to tell their story. Her voice trembled, not just from the cold but from the evident fear in her eyes. We used to live in the city. I worked at a shop, and Anna was a student. But then, a man destroyed our lives. Mary paused, her eyes reddening. His name is Frederick. A wealthy and powerful man. He took advantage of us, and when the truth came out, he threatened to get rid of us permanently if we dared speak out. Hearing this, Mrs. Josephine felt a surge of anger rise within her. But she didn't interrupt, allowing Mary to continue. He forced us to leave the city, saying that if we didn't disappear, he would make our lives a living hell. We had no other choice. Mary's voice broke, her trembling hands clutching the teacup. We've been wandering for weeks, too scared to trust anyone. But when we saw your house, we thought, maybe you'd help. Mrs. Josephine sat in silence, holding back tears. Mary's story brought back memories of her youth, when she too had been a young woman oppressed by an unjust society and powerful men. She understood all too well the despair these girls were feeling. Mary, Anna, you don't have to be afraid anymore, she said, her voice firm and resolute. You've come to the right place. No matter what happens, I won't let anyone hurt you." Mary looked at her with eyes full of gratitude, though laced with doubt. "But aren't you afraid? Frederick, he's very dangerous. If he finds out you're helping us, he might." "I'm not afraid," she interrupted, her gaze steady. "You don't need to worry about me. Now, get some rest. We'll figure things out tomorrow." Under Mrs. Josephine's guidance, Mary and Anna lay down on the small bed in the guest room. The firelight still flickered against the wooden walls, creating a rare sense of safety that the girls hadn't felt in a long time. Mrs. Josephine sat quietly by the fire, her eyes gazing out the window. Snow continued to fall, blanketing the forest outside. She knew that by opening her door to these girls, she had placed herself in grave danger. But her heart would not allow her to turn them away. In her mind, the images of Mary and Anna, two fragile lives caught in the cruelty of the world, compelled her to vow that she would protect them at all costs. Outside, the darkness remained, but inside Mrs. Josephine's small house, a light of compassion burned bright and warm, defying the bitter cold. Frederick Lawson, at 45, was a name known throughout the region not for any good deeds, but for his power and ruthlessness. A man who owned numerous properties, companies, and connections with top law enforcement officials, Frederick stood above the law. Not only was he wealthy, but he was infamous for his meticulously hidden misdeeds. It all began many years ago, when Frederick was still a young man. With his charming appearance and sweet words, he easily won the trust of many young women, especially those from difficult circumstances. Among them, Mary and Anna were his most recent victims, but they were far from the first to fall into Frederick's intricate trap. Mary, in her youth and naivety, once believed that Frederick was a sophisticated gentleman who would give her a bright future. His expensive gifts, sweet promises, and feigned attentiveness completely won Mary over. She thought she would marry Frederick and build a happy family with him. Little did she know that behind this facade lay a completely different man. One night, when Mary was invited to a party at Frederick's private home, she had no idea it would mark the beginning of her nightmare. After drinking a glass of wine Frederick gave her, Mary began to feel dizzy and lost consciousness. When she awoke, she found herself in an unfamiliar room, her clothes disheveled, and Frederick sitting beside her with a suggestive smile. She knew something terrible had happened, but Frederick didn't allow her to say a word. "You don't need to think too much about it, Mary," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You should realize how lucky you are to have my attention. But remember, if you breathe a word of this, not just you, but your entire family will pay the price." Fear kept Mary silent. She didn't dare tell anyone, not even Anna, her closest sister. But the horror didn't stop there. Not long after, Anna became Frederick's next victim. Using the same tactics, he repeated his crimes without an ounce of remorse. Frederick was not only skilled at manipulating young women but also adept at covering his tracks. With the help of local officials he had bribed, every accusation against him was silenced before it could gain traction. Those who dared to speak out against him were threatened or mysteriously disappeared. Before Mary and Anna, many other girls had fallen into his hands. Some were forced to have abortions, others driven out of the village because they couldn't endure the threats. There were even cases where women died under suspicious circumstances, but no one dared speak out for fear of retribution. Mary and Anna's case was unique. When Frederick learned that both were pregnant, he was furious. He was willing to do anything to force them to have abortions to erase all traces. However, Mary and Anna steadfastly refused. "You can threaten us, but I will not give up my child." Mary had once screamed at Frederick when he tried to coerce her. "Fine," he had replied coldly. "But you won't keep them for long." Those words hung over Mary and Anna like a curse, haunting them even in their sleep. They knew Frederick would not relent. He would do whatever it took to protect himself, even if it meant eliminating anyone who threatened his power. In addition to his personal crimes, Frederick was infamous for his shady connections in politics. He frequently donated large sums of money to election campaigns in exchange for protection from high-ranking officials. Honest police officers who tried to investigate Frederick were either transferred or forced to resign. But not everyone could be manipulated by him. People like Josephine knew Frederick's true nature. She had heard stories about him for years, though no one dared to come forward publicly. "He's a devil in human guise," she had once told others in the village. Now, with Mary and Anna seeking her help, Josephine knew she was facing great danger. She understood that Frederick would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Meanwhile, Frederick was quietly planning to silence all three of them. He couldn't afford any loose ends, especially with rumors that Diego, Josephine's son, was returning. A renowned lawyer with a reputation for brilliance, Diego could pose a real threat to Frederick, and he wasn't about to let that happen. The undercurrents of conflict began to stir. In the shadows, Frederick was weaving his web, preparing his next move. Frederick Lawson, with his charming appearance and extensive connections, had built an impenetrable wall of power that allowed him to manipulate everything to his will. In this small village, everyone knew Frederick as a wealthy and influential man, but few dared to speak openly about the shady dealings behind his facade. Frederick was more than just a successful businessman, he was a master of using money to buy influence and maintain his power network. Local officials, from the police chief to minor administrative workers, were all tied to him in one way or another. Anyone who dared to oppose Frederick was swiftly removed from the game, one way or another. One of Frederick's closest allies was Michael, the village's police chief. Michael had once been an upright man when he first took office, but over the years, he had become a puppet in Frederick's hands. Lavish gifts, luxurious trips, and even cash bribes were things Michael couldn't refuse. In return, Michael helped Frederick erase all traces of his crimes. When Mary and Anna became Frederick's victims, it was Michael who ensured that any attempts to report him were blocked. Every time Mary tried to file a complaint, she was met with cold, dismissive responses. "There's no evidence. We can't do anything," Michael would say, his eyes filled with mockery. The truth was, Michael wasn't unaware of the situation, he simply couldn't risk doing anything other than protect Frederick. Over the years, Michael had helped Frederick cover up numerous crimes, from assaults to bribery and even the mysterious disappearances of young women. Beyond Michael, Frederick's influence reached even further. He frequently hosted lavish parties, attended by officials from nearby regions. These events were more than just entertainment, they were opportunities for Frederick to consolidate his power. Fine wine, exquisite dishes, and envelopes stuffed with cash ensured the silence and loyalty of his guests. One regular attendee was Judge Anderson, a well-known figure whose position allowed him to influence legal proceedings in the area. Whenever someone attempted to sue Frederick, Anderson would find ways to dismiss or delay the cases. In return, Frederick ensured that Anderson enjoyed privileges no one else could access. But Frederick didn't stop at bribery. He was also infamous for threatening and eliminating those who dared to oppose him. Several villagers who tried to speak out about Frederick's wrongdoings faced severe consequences. Mrs. Marta, an elderly woman in the village, once witnessed Frederick assault a young girl many years ago. When she tried to tell the truth, her house mysteriously caught fire, forcing her to leave the village in silence. Everyone knew the fire was Frederick's doing, but no one dared to speak up, fearing they would be next. Another case involved Xavier, a young journalist who had investigated Frederick's shady activities. After Xavier published an article exposing Frederick's crimes, he was attacked on his way home. Though there was no concrete evidence, everyone knew Frederick was behind it. Since then, no journalist dared to go near Frederick or report on him again. Frederick's connections extended beyond the local level. He was linked to major organizations in the region, where he invested large sums of money in exchange for protection. These organizations not only laundered money for him but also provided forged documents whenever he needed them. With such an extensive power network, Frederick had built a system in which no one could touch him. Even those who knew the truth couldn't change the situation. Frederick was always one step ahead, ensuring that all loose ends were tied. Mary and Anna understood this all too well. They knew that without help from someone strong enough to stand up to Frederick, they would never escape his threats. But Frederick didn't stop there. When he learned that Mary and Anna had sought refuge with Josephine, he immediately devised a plan. He couldn't let the two sisters live to testify against him. "That old woman doesn't know who she's dealing with," Frederick told one of his henchmen. "I want them silenced permanently." Frederick ordered his men to monitor Josephine's house and find a way to eliminate all three women. He was unafraid to use violence, as long as it kept his secrets safe. A lone ray of sunlight pierced through the tree branches, but inside Josephine's small house, the atmosphere was heavy. Mary sat by the window, holding her belly, her face pale as she began to feel faint waves of pain. Anna lay curled up on the old wooden bed, her breathing shallow, her forehead damp with sweat. A fever had gripped her through the night, and her condition was worsening. Josephine, her hands trembling yet resolute, fought to remain calm. She had faced many hardships in her life, but this was perhaps the greatest challenge she had ever encountered. The two young women depended on her, and she knew that even the smallest mistake could bring everything crashing down. As she prepared a bowl of herbal water to reduce Anna's fever, Josephine kept glancing out the window. She knew Frederick wouldn't give up easily. Since the previous evening, she had noticed shadows moving around her property. Frederick wasn't even trying to hide his intentions, knowing full well that the villagers' fear would prevent them from interfering. Placing the bowl on the table, she grabbed a clean cloth, dipped it in the water, and wrung it out before laying it on Anna's forehead. "You must hold on, Anna. We'll get through this," she murmured, her voice soothing, though her eyes betrayed her worry. From the window, Mary called softly. "Grandma, I think someone is watching us." Josephine walked over to Mary and peered through a small gap in the curtain. The silhouette of a man in a black coat passed near the gate of her house. Her hand clenched the edge of the table. "They won't stop," she thought grimly. Refusing to let fear overwhelm her, Josephine turned back to Mary. "Don't worry, my dear. Stay here with Anna. I'll lock the doors and get everything ready." Josephine returned to the kitchen, her trembling hands rummaging through a drawer to find a sharp knife. She had never imagined she would need to use it for self-defense, but the current circumstances left her no choice. Outside the window, the shadows lurking among the pine trees seemed like ghosts, haunting her every second. In the living room, Mary bit her lip hard to maintain her composure, but the fear in her heart was evident in her eyes. She gently shook Anna, who lay weakly groaning on the bed. "Anna, you have to stay strong. We can't give up now." But Anna only responded with a vacant stare, her breathing growing heavier by the moment. Outside, the wind howled relentlessly, as if nature itself was rebelling alongside human hearts. Josephine could feel the oppressive coldness tightening its grip. She turned to Mary, her voice firm but calm. "I'll do everything I can to protect you, but you must listen to me. Do not panic." Mary nodded, though her hands, clenched tightly and white-knuckled, betrayed her tension. She glanced at Anna, her heart swelling with despair. Anna's condition was not only due to her fever but also the paralyzing fear that had drained her spirit. Mary knew that without help, neither she nor her sister might survive the night. Josephine picked up the oil lamp and moved to the door. Pressing her ear against it, she could hear strange noises outside. Heavy footsteps crunched slowly through the snow, deliberate and menacing. Her heart pounded, but she kept her hand steady. "They're getting closer," she thought. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the rear window. Mary screamed in panic, triggering a faint cry from Anna. Josephine rushed toward the window, but all she caught was the shadow of a man darting past in the darkness. "They're testing us," she murmured, her voice low. Mary clung tightly to Anna, tears silently streaming down her face. She could do nothing but pray quietly. But deep down, she knew that prayers wouldn't save them from Frederick's cruel hands. A pounding on the door shattered the eerie silence. Josephine slowly approached it, her eyes flashing with vigilance. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice steady but tinged with unease. "Josephine, open the door." "It's Michael," a man's voice called from outside. Josephine recognized the police chief's voice, but she knew all too well that Michael worked for Frederick. She didn't trust him. She didn't answer. "Josephine, I know you're hiding Mary and Anna." "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Michael said coldly. "Frederick wants them. You know he's not someone to cross." Mary clutched Anna tighter, tears flowing freely. "Grandma, please don't open the door," she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Josephine had no intention of opening the door, but she knew Michael wouldn't leave easily. The pounding on the door continued, each thud hammering at her resolve. She stepped to the drawer and retrieved her late husband's old gun. "If they force their way in, I'll fight to the end," she thought. Outside, Michael's patience wore thin. "Fine, if you won't open the door, we'll come in ourselves." Moments later, a loud crash echoed as the door was kicked violently, shaking on its hinges. Josephine stepped back, the gun in her hand aimed firmly at the door. The door burst open, and Michael entered with two other men. His gaze swept across the room, landing on Mary and Anna. "There they are," he said, a cold smile creeping onto his face. "You shouldn't have meddled in this, Josephine. Get out of my house now." Josephine shouted, her gun unwavering. But Michael showed no fear. "Do you really think you can stop us?" he sneered. "Hand over the girls before things get worse." Mary and Anna huddled together on the bed, their eyes wide with terror. Josephine stood firm. "They're not going anywhere," she declared, her voice resolute. But she knew she was just an elderly woman, no match for these men in physical strength. Michael stepped closer, but before he could reach Mary, Josephine pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed, the bullet embedding itself in the wall near Michael. He jumped back, startled. "You dare shoot at me?" he shouted, anger flashing in his eyes. "Get out of my house now!" Josephine roared. But she knew this was only the first step in a long and uneven battle. Frederick received Michael's report that they had failed to take Mary and Anna. He was furious. "Useless fools," he bellowed into the phone. "I don't want excuses. Solve this problem immediately." In the small house, Josephine, Mary, and Anna could find no peace. Josephine worked to reinforce the door, but she knew it wouldn't hold for long. Mary sat beside Anna, trying to comfort her sister. But Anna's breathing grew rapid, and her body began to convulse slightly. "Grandma, Anna's not okay." Mary cried out, tears streaming down her face. Josephine rushed over to check on Anna. "She's going into shock. We need to get her to a doctor," she said, but both she and Mary knew that leaving the house was impossible. Outside, shadows began to gather, the faint beams of flashlights flickering through the windows. Mary felt her heart stop. "They're getting ready to break in," she whispered, her voice trembling with despair. Josephine gripped Mary's hand tightly. "I'll protect you both to the end. But if I can't, you must promise me you'll protect Anna, no matter what happens." Mary nodded, but her eyes were filled with utter fear. Outside, Frederick himself arrived, standing among his henchmen. "Josephine, you should come out and talk. I don't want to hurt anyone, but you're leaving me no choice," his voice called out, cold and threatening. Josephine glanced out the window, seeing Frederick and his men. She knew there was no negotiating with the devil. She turned back to look at Mary and Anna one last time, her eyes full of love and determination. "You stay here with Anna." "I will go out," Josephine said. Mary sobbed, grabbing her hand. "Grandma, please don't go. We can face this together." Josephine shook her head, gently prying Mary's hands away. Take care of Anna. I will do everything I can to protect you. With those words, she stepped outside, confronting the danger that awaited in the darkness. The door closed behind her, leaving Mary and Anna inside the small house, where the flickering firelight could not chase away the overwhelming fear that filled the air. Frederick stood outside the house, his demeanor calm yet calculated. He did not rush to break in. He knew that violence was not always the only way to achieve his goals. This time, Frederick decided to rely on his most trusted strategy, bribery. It was a tactic that had gotten him out of countless dangerous situations before, and he was confident that Josephine, an elderly woman, would not be able to resist the lure of money. He signaled his men to step back, projecting an image of someone who had no intention of hostility. Holding a small briefcase in his hand, Frederick ascended the steps, his cold eyes fixed on the door. He knocked 3 times, each knock echoing in the quiet of the winter night. Inside, Josephine stared at the door, her grip on the gun unwavering. She didn't respond or move closer. Josephine, Frederick's voice rang out, deep and clear. I'm not here to cause trouble. I want to talk to you, as adults. Josephine stayed silent. She knew that any words Frederick spoke would be lies, wrapped in a polished veneer. But Frederick was not one to give up easily. He stepped closer, his tone softening, like a serpent hissing its temptation. Josephine, I know you're a smart woman. I don't want anyone in that house to get hurt. We're both reasonable people. Why don't we find a solution that works for everyone? Still, Josephine remained silent, her grip tightening on the gun's handle. She heard every word, but she refused to let them sway her. Frederick continued, his voice carefully crafted to sound sincere. You know who I am, and you know what I'm capable of. But I don't want to resort to that. I'm here with an offer, not a threat. Let's resolve this peacefully. He placed the briefcase on the step and opened it. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash, illuminated by a flashlight. Josephine, this is money, a lot of money. Enough for you to live the rest of your life in comfort. All you need to do is hand over Mary and Anna, and this money is yours. You can leave this village and live the rest of your days in luxury. No one gets hurt, and no one faces consequences. Frederick's offer cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Mary, sitting in the corner with Anna, heard everything. She clutched Anna tightly, her eyes filled with terror. She won't agree, Mary whispered, as if to reassure herself. Josephine stepped closer to the door, not to open it, but to speak. Her voice was clear and firm. Frederick, what kind of person do you take me for, thinking you can buy me with money? These girls are not commodities, and I am not a greedy fool. Frederick smirked, though her defiance irked him. Josephine, don't act so self-righteous. You live alone, and old age has come. This money could change your life, give you a good ending instead of facing unnecessary danger. If not for yourself, think of the girls inside. If you hand them over, I promise no harm will come to them. Frederick, I know exactly what kind of person you are, Josephine replied coldly. You promise no harm. What you've already done to them, what is that, if not harm? I don't believe you, and I don't want your filthy money. Leave now, before I lose my patience. Frederick's eyes darkened, his hand clenching into a fist. Josephine's scorn and resistance tested his limits. Josephine, he growled, his voice thick with menace. You don't understand your position. This is not an offer, it's your last chance. Refuse, and I can't promise things will remain peaceful. Don't talk to me as if I'm a fool, Frederick, Josephine shot back, her tone unyielding. Do you think I'm afraid of you? I've lived through war, lost my family, and faced pain you couldn't imagine. If you think your threats can shake me, you're sorely mistaken. Frederick stepped back, his face dark with frustration. He glanced at his henchman standing in the shadows, his eyes flashing with rage. But he knew that forcing his way into the house now was not a wise move. "You'll regret this, Josephine," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "You'll see that your stubbornness will bring nothing but suffering." He slammed the briefcase shut and retreated toward the car waiting in the shadows. Before getting in, he turned to look at the house one last time. "This isn't over. I'll be back, and next time, you won't have a choice." The door rattled slightly as Frederick and his men left, leaving a heavy, unsettling silence in their wake. But Josephine knew this was only the beginning of a larger storm. She gripped the gun tightly, her eyes filled with resolve. Whatever Frederick planned for his return, she would never give in. The phone rang on a quiet afternoon in the office of Diego, Josephine's only son. Sunlight streamed through the large windows as Diego sat at his desk, poring over legal documents. When he answered the call from an old neighbor, his face darkened. The story of his mother's plight, along with the dire situation of Mary and Anna, stirred a fire within him. "I'll come home immediately," Diego said, his voice resolute. He quickly rearranged his schedule and called on his closest friends, fellow skilled lawyers he had worked with for years. Diego knew that to take down someone as dangerous as Frederick, he couldn't do it alone. Within just one night, Diego arrived at the village where he was born and raised. His presence brought a renewed sense of hope to Josephine and the two sisters, Mary and Anna. Entering his mother's small house, Diego embraced Josephine tightly, his eyes brimming with determination. "Mother, I won't let this continue. I will protect you and these girls," Diego said firmly. Josephine, trying to maintain her composure, couldn't hide her emotions. "Diego, I trust you. But Frederick is not someone to take lightly. He wields too much power. His power exists only because no one has dared to stand against him." "I will change that, Mother," Diego replied. That evening, Diego spent hours listening to Mary recount the entire story. The young girl trembled as she relived what Frederick had done to her and her sister. The physical and emotional scars were still fresh, but Mary's eyes held a glimmer of hope knowing Diego was on their side. "We don't know what to do anymore. He has too many people protecting him. Even the police chief, Michael, works for him," Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. "That's why we need the law," Diego asserted. "Frederick thinks he's above the law, but I'll show him otherwise. We'll need evidence, testimony, and the strength of justice." The next day, Diego contacted his group of lawyer friends. They quickly devised a detailed plan. First, Diego began collecting evidence based on Mary and Anna's experiences. Then, he reached out to other victims of Frederick. This was a challenging task, as most of them were paralyzed by fear and had remained silent for years. Through patience and skillful persuasion, Diego gradually convinced some victims to come forward. They felt safer knowing a skilled legal team was ready to defend them. Some had been threatened or had lost loved ones because of Frederick, and they were now determined to ensure he could no longer evade justice. Diego also reached out to media outlets and non-governmental organizations. Leveraging his connections, he made it clear that exposing Frederick wasn't just a personal matter, it was a significant step toward dismantling the corrupt power structures in the area. As Diego delved deeper, he uncovered the extensive criminal network Frederick had built. From bribing officials to assaulting women and orchestrating mysterious disappearances, Frederick's web of crimes extended far and wide. Diego realized that this fight wasn't just about protecting his mother and the two sisters, it was an opportunity to free the entire village from Frederick's grip. The night before the legal campaign was set to begin, Diego sat beside Josephine, holding her hand tightly. "Mother, I won't let anyone harm you. I promise," he said, his eyes filled with conviction. Josephine smiled, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in days. Despite the challenges ahead, she believed her son would bring justice. The next morning, the plan officially began. Diego's colleagues from the city arrived at the village, armed with documents, cameras, and even a security team. Together, they prepared for the legal battle against Frederick. While Frederick remained confident that he was untouchable, Diego and his team were determined to make him pay. As Diego and his legal team got to work, the village began buzzing with activity. Victims who had stayed silent out of fear were inspired by Diego's determination and the support of the legal team. They started gathering at Josephine's house, which became a secret hub for preparing the case against Frederick. Diego didn't rely solely on Mary and Anna's testimonies, he also collected other critical evidence. One of the most significant discoveries was the journal of a former victim, detailing the times Frederick had assaulted and threatened her. Additionally, Diego uncovered financial records proving Frederick had used illicit funds to bribe officials and cover up his crimes. "This is the key," Diego said, placing the documents on the table. "We're not just proving his guilt, we're exposing the corrupt network he's built." Mary looked at the files, her eyes shining with hope. "Do you think we have a chance?" she asked. Diego nodded confidently. "Not just a chance, a victory. But it won't be easy. He will fight back." Diego organized private meetings with the victims, helping them prepare emotionally and practically for court appearances. Many were hesitant at first, but Diego's unwavering resolve and the assurance of his team inspired them to believe that justice was possible. "I've stayed silent for too long," said an older woman, one of Frederick's earliest victims. "But if I don't speak out now, no one will stop him from hurting others." Her words fueled the growing momentum. Gradually, the number of witnesses increased, creating a wave of resistance against Frederick. Frederick, realizing the growing threat, began making defensive moves. He leveraged his connections to pressure the police and local authorities, attempting to stall the investigation. However, Diego had anticipated these tactics. During an encounter at the local police station, Frederick smirked at Diego. "You think you can take me down? Lawyers like you are nothing but ants before an elephant." Diego remained unfazed, meeting Frederick's gaze with steely resolve. "You think you're above the law, but I'll prove that no one escapes justice, not even you." Diego didn't confine his efforts to courtrooms. He also used the media to bring Mary and Anna's story to light. Articles exposing Frederick's crimes began appearing in major newspapers, igniting public outrage. Human rights organizations and women's advocacy groups joined the fight, adding immense pressure on the authorities. The villagers, long silenced by fear of Frederick's power, started speaking out. They organized public meetings, demanding justice for Mary, Anna, and other victims. Frederick's once unshakable influence began to crumble under the weight of collective resistance. "A man like Frederick cannot continue to dominate here," a villager declared loudly at a public meeting. Applause erupted, signaling that change was near. When Diego and his team finalized the documents and gathered enough witnesses, the police had no choice but to act. Under public pressure and faced with undeniable evidence, an arrest warrant for Frederick was issued. On a cold morning in the village square, Frederick was handcuffed and taken away in front of the townspeople. "This isn't over," Frederick shouted as he was escorted into the police car. "I'll be back." But Diego knew that with the mountain of crimes exposed, Frederick wouldn't escape this time. The crowd surrounded the police car, expressing their outrage at Frederick. A woman shouted, "Justice has finally arrived." Cheers erupted, creating an atmosphere thick with emotion. Mary and Anna stood silently amidst the crowd, unable to hold back their tears. They were tears of relief and hope. Holding each other tightly, they felt the darkest days were now behind them. Diego stood beside them, placing a reassuring hand on Mary's shoulder. "Justice will be served. He will never harm you again," he said, his voice full of conviction. Just a few weeks after Frederick's arrest, his trial began. The courtroom was packed with people, not only victims but also villagers, journalists, and advocates from various organizations. Everyone was eager to witness one of the most powerful and ruthless men finally face justice. Diego, representing the victims as their lawyer, stood with confidence. Beside him were his colleagues, some of the best attorneys he had assembled for the case. Mary and Anna sat in the front row, their faces tense but illuminated by hope. I am not standing here today just for Mary and Anna but for all the victims who have suffered because of Frederick Lawson, Diego began his opening statement. This is not just about personal justice. It's about protecting our society from those who abuse their power to trample on others. Diego systematically presented the evidence in court. First, the diary of a former victim was introduced, detailing the assaults and threats Frederick had inflicted. Then came the financial documents proving Frederick's use of dirty money to bribe officials and cover his tracks. Witnesses took the stand one by one, recounting their harrowing experiences with Frederick, their stories stirring anger and sympathy among those in the courtroom. Mary and Anna bravely stepped forward to testify. Mary, her voice trembling but resolute, recounted the horrors Frederick had subjected her and her sister to. He didn't just destroy our lives, he sowed fear and despair. But today, we are no longer afraid of him, she said, looking Frederick directly in the eye. Sitting at the defendant's table, Frederick tried to appear calm, but his unease was evident. He hadn't anticipated that the victims he once dismissed as powerless would find the courage to stand against him. Meanwhile, Frederick's shady connections were also exposed. Several officials he had bribed were investigated and forced to resign. Police Chief Michael, who had shielded Frederick, was prosecuted and faced imprisonment for enabling criminal activities. This marked a significant blow, completely dismantling Frederick's power network. Honest police officers who had been sidelined by Frederick returned to collaborate with Diego. Among them was Lieutenant Xavier, who testified about how Frederick had manipulated the legal system for years. He couldn't have done what he did without the help of corrupt officials. But today, things will change, Xavier declared. After several days of intense proceedings, the court reached a verdict. When the judge rose to announce the sentence, the entire courtroom fell silent. The defendant, Frederick Lawson, is sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for charges of sexual assault, intimidation, bribery, and organized crime. Furthermore, the defendant is ordered to pay substantial reparations to the victims, including Mary and Anna, to compensate for the harm caused. The courtroom erupted in applause. Some people even cried tears of joy. Frederick bowed his head, no longer carrying the arrogance he once had. He knew his life of freedom was over. After the trial, Mary and Anna walked out of the courthouse hand in hand. They cried, but this time, it was tears of release and freedom. Diego stood beside them, smiling gently. "You did it. You are both incredibly strong," he said. "Thank you, Diego. Without you, we don't know what would have happened to us," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much," Anna added, her smile weak but full of gratitude. News of Frederick's downfall spread quickly. The small village, once stifled by his domination, was now filled with joy and hope. Villagers who had lived in fear began to open up, helping one another and rebuilding their community. Mary and Anna received support from non-governmental organizations, which helped them start new lives. They decided to stay in the village, opening a small shop and beginning to build a future for themselves and their unborn children. Josephine, her eyes filled with pride, watched as the young women recovered from the physical and emotional scars. "You deserve happiness," she said warmly. A week after the trial, Diego returned to the city to resume his work as a lawyer. But he left with a heart full of pride and peace. He knew that his efforts had not only helped his mother but also liberated an entire village and many other victims. As the bus drove away from the village, Diego received a text from Mary. "You are our hero. We will never forget what you've done." Diego smiled, looking back at the village fading into the golden hues of the sunset. He knew that, even from afar, his heart would always remain tied to this place where he had truly made a difference. The story of Diego, Mary, and Anna reminds us that justice can prevail when courage and unity come together. No matter how powerful and intimidating someone may appear, the light of truth and determination can pierce through the darkest of shadows. It serves as a call to respect the rule of law, to never stay silent in the face of injustice, and to protect the vulnerable. Above all, it teaches us that compassion and resolve can not only save individuals but also bring transformation to an entire community.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.